This podcast is part of a series presented in conjunction with Synthtopia.com. Thanks so much to Synthtopia for the logistical help and other support. This podcast is also partially supported by Isotonic Studios, the creator of many Max for Life devices that you're sure to know. Hope you enjoy their work, and thank you so much for listening. Okay, this week I have a very special guest. His name's Andrew Belt. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, let me use a word that probably does, VCV Rack. This thing has come on like a freight train. It went from, I had never heard of it, to it's monopolizing Synthtopia's main page, as well as the discussions of a lot of people on Muff Wiggler and on the Lion site and everything. It's really caught fire. And so the main person behind that is Andrew. So it's really great we're getting a chance to talk to him as kind of the opening salvo here for my collaborative work with Synthtopia on kind of the heroes of open source work. So with that, I'm going to say hello to Andrew. Hey, Andrew, how's it going?
Hi, how's it going? I'm good.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat. I really appreciate it. Let's start off by having you talk about your work, because in addition to just saying VCV Rack, which is going to light up a lot of people's eyeballs, you've been doing a lot of other stuff in the audio area too. So why don't you just kind of fill us in on what you've been up to?
That's right. So in February, when the Synthesis Technology E370 Kickstarter kicked off, I started the Wave Edit software for SynthTech. And around that time, I was all VCV Rack. So that's actually mostly what I've been doing in the last year. But I've been hanging around the community for a few years, and I just decided I'm going to write software. So that's what I do.
Very interesting. Well, now, boy, just having played with it a little bit, believe me, I've got like this whole head full of questions about the development and stuff. But I'm going to start off with maybe one that's kind of the most obvious, or at least most obvious to me. There's a bunch of modular software out there already, but all of the modular software so far has kind of gone out of its way to like abstract the idea of a modular synth into being, whether it's Max or Reactor or PD or whatever. There's been this abstraction into little boxes and, atomic user interface elements. You decided really go the other way to have your system looks as much like a modular Eurorack system as my Pittsburgh structure full of modules looks like. I mean, it's that dead on. What made you decide to go that direction?
Well, a funny story. I'm really stubborn. I think most people on the GitHub and the Facebook probably know that by now. Any recommendation that comes up, I'll either say yes or no, and that's it. That's one thing that I did with the UI. I wanted people to experience what it looked like, which I think is just as important as what it feels like or what it sounds like. What it looks like is, a modular Eurorack system. It's supposed to be based around Eurorack. Mm-hmm. There might be some modules coming out that use other formats, but I chose Eurorack because it's popular in the last couple years. It's taken over the world. And I guess 3 years ago is when I kind of started the idea behind VCV Rack. I hadn't worked on the development of it at that point, but I decided that there are about a half of people that really like using UI that's modeled after hardware, mm-hmm. and then the other half, which would probably prefer a more abstract interface, which is what you're talking about. But if you look at the market about 3 years ago, there were a few packages that pure data is probably the most abstract that you can get. Right. I guess you could get into programming languages, and that would be a bit more abstract than pure data. But so we had the abstract stuff covered. You can make modular music by using other ways of setting up the modules and moving the parameters and everything, but nothing that really satisfies the full experience. And that's what I wanted to get at with VCV Rack. So that's why I chose that design style. It's mostly just stubbornness and keeping my philosophy from when I started the project. That's really all it is.
I think that that's actually smart though, because in my experience at least, the most successful software developers tend to have a certain level of stubbornness because it prevents you from having to chase after every red herring and every squirrel that runs across the path with a good
Yeah.
idea, right?
hmm If I took every feature request, first off, I would have 3 years of work to do. And then second, it would be the most bloated software ever. I have to throw some stuff out, but
Well, it is the case though that I think when you take a look at feature requests, they always expand at about a 3-to-1 level from the time that you have available. So over the first year, you're going to get for sure 3 years worth of stuff. But
mm,
you haven't even, I mean, when did you first release this out into the wild? Because I just
it was
heard of it like a few weeks ago.
it was at Knobcon actually.
Ah, okay. Oh
I
yeah, that's right.
released it. I was eating lunch at Knobcon on the Sunday or something like that,
Uh-huh.
and someone was trying to ask me questions. And I was like, "Hold on." So yeah, I released the website, and then a bunch of people downloaded it. But that was at Knobcon while people were coming up to me. Uh,
Wow, that's
I was
hilarious.
staying up the previous few nights, so I was late. Essentially, I'm always late on everything. That's another thing about me.
Yeah, that's hilarious though. The idea that you're just like eating lunch and boom, there it is. Um, One of the things I also noticed is that not only have you gone with a very traditional modular Eurorack type look, but you have engaged my friend Wes Milholen in doing some of the design work for that. How did you get to know him, and how did he get him involved?
Let's see. I think I blind contacted him around November of last year, of
Hmm.
2016. Yeah, I think he just picked up the idea and he started liking it just as much as I did. And he wasn't super involved initially, but then he started ramping up during the summer when we worked on the fundamental plugin pack, which is the thing that Rack comes with.
Okay.
So yeah, I blind contacted him. He liked the idea. I gave him a really early alpha version to play with, and he liked it. So yeah, I mean, you can do that in this community. You can just email someone and make connections. It's really easy. Everyone's friendly.
Yeah, well, and I think also too, there's a sense to which, especially since you're doing this in kind of a in an open sourcey kind of way, there's not this sense like you have to hoard your knowledge so that you can, eventually cash in an IPO, right?
Right.
This is a lot more like you're in the process of not even developing a community, but just sort of like gathering interested participants to get to know each other, right? I already have started like looking at, how people are interacting with it and the kind of excitement that's come with it. And it's drawn in people from the modular community, but it's also drawn in people who sort of were frustrated by the modular community, either
Hmm.
because of its high expense or because of the physicality, which, for some people isn't viable.
hmm
If you travel a lot or if you have a really small place, even the smallest Euro rack gets to be a little bit of trouble, right?
Yeah.
And so this all of a sudden, this virtualization, while still maintaining a valid kind of system concept, that really caught a lot of new people as well as the old stalwarts.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, and there are a lot of people that just want to play around. I'm sort of young, and a lot of young people have no money, so this is good for them.
Right.
I kind of write this for myself actually, and I have a Euro rack. It's impossible to haul around, so I do take rack to coffee shops if I want to play around with it.
Hmm.
There's a lot you can do with virtualization that might not be as pleasing as turning knobs and patching cables in real life. I think the advantages and disadvantages kind of weigh equally with that.
Well, I know certainly from the standpoint, one of the things virtualization does is it gives you an opportunity to test out ridiculous options, right?
hmm Yeah.
Like, what happens if I have an FM patch with like 20 oscillators feeding into the FM input of the one next to it, right? What could that be like? Well, I'm not going to go
Right.
out and spend the $4,000 it takes to actually try that in the real world, but it's nice to have some mechanism by which I can take that for a spin, right?
hmm
I'm kind of amazed because I also went and took a look at your GitHub account, and you've been kind of like sneaky playing around with music technology stuff for a little bit for a bit of time now, as well as seeing the wave edit thing out there. It's clear you've got some chops in DSP programming. What's your background, and how did you get into both programming and modular synthesis in a way that puts you in a position to actually be able to pull this off? Where are you coming from?
Well, let's see. Around 3 years ago, I was still working on my math and physics degree at University of Tennessee. I didn't have much free time, so I didn't really work on software for synthesizers, but I had time to play with synthesizers.
Hmm.
For some reason, I just have to write software constantly, whether it's about school or whatever I'm doing. It could be about video. I need a creative outlet, so I'm not very good at making music. I'm really good at math, I guess. So instead of actually making music, I could use math to make music, and that's really the only outlet you can do with that.
Right.
So I've been programming for a while. I've been doing a lot of graphics, actually. I'm very graphics heavy. DSP is difficult. It's a whole other animal than graphics is,
Hmm.
but it's more math heavy. So I think compared to graphics, which is more of a computer science field, DSP and analog signal processing and circuit design is a lot of mathematics. So that's where I get my background, just from working on the math degree. I don't do anything specific to DSP outside of VCV Rack right now,
Okay.
but I've played around with some stuff in the past.
It's interesting you say that because I never really thought about it, but yeah, if you think of graphics, it starts with geometry, but it really goes afield from there, and so you end up
Mm,
with all these levels of abstraction that you get with OpenGL and all this kind of stuff, right?
right.
When you talk about DSP, I mean, half of the people that are doing it can't be bothered with the C++ compiler because they want to work on raw C and do a bunch of assembler as well.
Right.
And so in a way there's kind of an old school and close to the iron effect really with the DSP stuff. How hard was it for you to basically say, well, I'm going to learn enough of this to be able to crunch those numbers?
I
Did you
don't
find
know.
it fairly easy?
Sort of. It's a whole other field. It's something that you don't really get taught in a math or physics degree.
Hmm.
I'd probably have more of an exposure to it if I was an electrical engineering major at the time when I started. I don't know. If you work on it for 2 years, I would say you can get to the point to where you can really understand the field as a whole, and you can say that this modern method is better than this modern method instead of just
Right.
looking at the fundamentals. So you have to know your Fourier transforms, and then on the computer side, you have to know like your SIMD computations and everything that makes DSP possible with that. So it's a lot of custom knowledge that you don't really get outside of DSP.
Right. It's I hate using this word because right now it kind of has a bad reputation, but it seems like DSP is almost like an artisanal version of programming, right? In that it is like it's like some kind of obscure knowledge, but also it's one of those things that kind of preferences people that are going to almost like full time it, right?
Hmm.
And it's hard to just sort of like dip in and do a thing and dip out. Now, a question for you then is in building this software, first of all, great work making it available not only on Mac and Windows, but on Linux. I think that that's fantastic because I think that we're going to see so much more action in the Linux audio world.
Hmm.
I think it's just obvious, right? So much audio software now is being produced using the Juice library, right? But you
Right.
didn't use that.
No, I didn't. I have tried it probably 3 or 4 years ago. It's a huge library. It does a lot. I would say about half the reason I didn't choose that is because I want VCV Rack to be completely free of license
Encumbrance, yeah,
encumberment.
right,
So
yeah.
Juice, I could be wrong. I think it's GL plus a commercial license
Right.
right now, anyway. I'm probably years out of date. So that's fine. But first off, the GPL is too complicated, I think.
Mm.
I try to stay away from it for my own projects, although I think Wave Edit is licensed under GPL. So yeah, the license is about half of it. it's great and everyone should probably use it. But I just wanted my stuff to be free from that.
Right.
And then the second thing is, in order to really fully understand what I'm doing, I just have to write the entire library over again. I know that's really horrible. It means that I can't work with people well and work with people's code, but that's essentially what it is. I can't understand what something is doing if I didn't write it.
I think though I think that that's more fundamentally important than you're making out to be, and you're being very self-deprecating about it. But I also think that there's something kind of like really powerful in what you just said, because right now a lot of software seems to be developed by almost like grabbing pre-built pieces off the
Mm-hmm.
shelf and bolting them together in order to making your own personal Frankenstein, right?
Right.
But
Yeah,
the
that's right.
problem is, so often what happens is if something goes haywire, it's like, well, okay, I'll put this piece back and I'll try a different piece that looks like it. And there's not a sense that people are really understanding it at the core. And I don't think necessarily everybody in the world has to know
Right.
everything down to the semicolon, but I do think it's useful to at least on some projects, and especially projects that represent your passion. Why the hell wouldn't you want to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You know? So
Yeah, that's an important part of it.
yeah, I think so. Well, and it's important too because it does put you in a position to like really learn a lot about the scheme of what you're doing as well.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get into the music side of this thing? I mean, were you musical as a kid, or was it just something that was an interesting sidelight when you were going to school? How did you get into music half of this? Because there's a lot of there's a lot of ways to get paid better than making fake modular synthesizers, right?
Right.
So I'm wondering
Yeah.
where did the music side come from?
I've always been musical. My family's been musical. Let's see. I was in my middle school orchestra. I played the string bass.
Nice.
That was good stuff. That led me into joining a band and playing a bass for an electric bass for probably 3 years. We were somewhat successful in the city level of my hometown.
Where was your hometown?
Where was that? That was Johnson City, Tennessee. And they still haven't really picked up the electronic style of music right now. It's all stuck in kind of punk from the very early 2000s, maybe late 90s. So that's kind of what it was.
Okay.
So I did that, and I bought some synthesizers just because I thought they'd be kind of interesting. And then that just took off for me. I was so distracted by the synthesizers that I couldn't really practice my instrument that I was supposed to be playing. So we just have all these garbage sounds in the background of punk rock, which was just me playing with a microKORG or something like that.
Right.
So I started using synthesizers, and then I started getting into digital audio and using things like Ableton Live and Reason to sequence the music to play in that band. I eventually left that band. They went on and did things. They're probably still not around. So anyway, I had a pretty unimpressive life with digital audio in the last 10 years. But I was always interested in how the stuff was made and how the sounds were actually being generated.
Mhm.
And so I kept going deeper and deeper into the lower level ways of synthesis. And then I discovered modular probably 6 years ago. That really captivated me because it's a really good way to see what you're actually putting together, in a literal sense. You're putting together modules. Oh yeah, and also in the music note, I was trying to be a concert pianist about 2 years ago, and if I was successful at that, we probably wouldn't have VCV Rack.
Right.
I got pretty good though.
Really?
I'm really good at piano and polyphonic stuff. Makes VCV Rack kind of nice because you can sort of play polyphonic.
Right.
We have a quad MIDI interface, which is enough for me, I guess.
Sure.
Um,
So when you say that you're good at polyphonic stuff, do you mean like the way that you hear music in your head? You're able to hear polyphony in your head?
uh,
Or is it that like physically your hands and stuff are able to cope with it?
Probably the most accurate thing to say would be when I want to perform music, some people think of a monophonic, maybe a melody. They'll think of the melody. I like thinking about the background chords of stuff. That's why I really love disco, because
Yeah.
disco has these weird chord sequences that you don't hear in modern pop or something like that.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say that because I am exactly the opposite. I, for a long time, was a guitar player, and I started playing bass, and I loved it because I came to realize that when I think of music, I really think monophonically, right?
Hmm.
That's how I work my way through a thing. And so it's really, I'm kind of envious of the idea that that's how you negotiate musical thought, but it also does make it seem kind of weird that modular would have even come on your radar then.
Yeah, I don't know. I think sound design is just more interesting than music composition. Really.
Well, I was going to ask about that because people come to modular systems for a lot of reasons. Some people come to them for sound design because you can sort of like work at the elemental level, and also because like sounds and control voltages and all that, they're all just signals, right? It's the one
Right.
thing I always carped about with bookless systems, this idea that audio and signals were two different things.
Hmm.
I always
Yep,
like thinking
that's
of it
right.
as exactly the same thing, right? But, for sound designers, it's really valuable. But other people really come to it because it's sort of like a physical generative system.
Right.
And other people come to it because they can make an idiosyncratic instrument that then they'll kind of keep the same forever.
Right.
And I'm always curious with people who have kind of unique backgrounds, what it is that drew them into modular.
I think the answer to that is just really unimpressive. It's the one thing that maybe is different from me than some other people that get into music is I just want to keep getting lower and lower level into the fundamentals of what I'm doing. So that's the key.
So,
Until I can't make music because I'm thinking about the details too much. So
right.
yep,
Well, you say, I mean, it's funny because the other thing you said that really caught my attention was this idea that you have to be coding all the time, right?
yep,
And again, I sort of understand that, and I think that's a really neat thing. The question is, since you like coding all the time, do you also like coding the same thing, or is it like now that there's an implementation of VCV Rack, you want to get onto something else?
I do like sticking to one thing. I've usually had a theme in the last few programming projects. VCV has the trait of pulling together almost everything that I'm interested in into one software package. So if I'm bored with working on DSP, I can just work on graphics, or I can work on the website, which is another thing. Uh, so it's pretty much everything. It requires a lot of maintenance in many areas. So I don't really lose interest in the project as a whole. I might put down the whole project for a day or two, and then I want to work on cleaning up code just for no reason. So I'll just get back into that.
Right, right. Now, this being a open source project kind of gives you some relief from some of the more onerous parts of this too, because I would imagine, especially running on three different systems, it would probably be a little bit of a pain if all of a sudden you started getting maintenance requests from people with, you know, Windows XP and an old Digidesign Studio 8 sound card, and why won't VCV Rack work on my system, Or do
I
you still
definitely
get
still
those?
get
Oh,
those.
you do? Okay.
Yeah, I was talking to one of my friends today. I was frustrated. People are just asking me like, "Hey, it doesn't work on my Commodore 64 when I set the screen resolution to 800 by 12." Like, I just get all this weird stuff, and I don't have 50 different computers, so I can't.
Right.
But no, it still exists. I think being open source probably even makes it more likely to get support requests because you can see what's going on inside and want to change it in some way. I'm using a few fundamental libraries for compatibility for the audio, MIDI, graphics, and some of the things. I'm kind of trusting those libraries to give me as much compatibility as I can or as they can. Yeah, I think this is a good test, or VCV Rack is a good test for those libraries and how they compare with other proprietary solutions. I don't know if it's better or worse. I think I've had some problems with commercial software packages that I don't see in the open source ones, but ideally in a year or two, I think enough people will join the project with the expertise to fix their own compatibility issues, which will go back into the projects and then eventually find their way into VCV.
Well, I was wondering about that because one of the things you said is that you don't feel like you work well with other people, but one of the things that kind of is necessary, especially when you take on, when you kind of do trying to hit the home run here with software packages, you kind of need a group of people to work with that are going to help you handle some of these technical issues. Maybe in systems that you're not super familiar with, or systems that you never wanted to be familiar with, right?
Yep. Yeah, I'd like to take advantage of the software modularity of VCV. So I'm using libraries. I'm not rewriting every part of every piece. So there are some libraries that I'd love for people to just take off with. For example, a sample rate converter would be really nice with all the requirements that I demand. Like audio issues. I'd love to not be in those projects and just have everyone else deal with them. I like being an application developer rather than a library developer. I
Hmm.
could be
Right.
writing something to be used in other software, but developing an application means that you don't have any demands that aren't yours, essentially. I would say if someone else picked up half of the work on VCV Rack, that'd be fine with me, but I'd have to get used to that, essentially.
Right. So when you say as an application developer, there aren't problems that aren't yours, are you meaning in comparison to a library developer who might have to support someone who's doing like a telephony application in Singapore or something, as opposed to what it is you're doing? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah, library applications, or sorry, libraries have many software packages that are using it, so they have to keep the APIs very stable. With Rack, I guess I have to keep the API stable for the plugin developers. Oh yeah, that's another thing. I guess Rack is right now not really an application, but a library for the other plugins. Um,
Or a hosting environment or something? Yeah.
sure, yeah, yeah. A big chunk of it is actually compiled into the plugins that everyone is developing, so there is a library component.
Oh, okay. So let's talk a little bit about plugin development and plugin developers. So first of all, I noticed that you have some pretty interesting tooling up there. You have basically software emulations or software implementations of a lot of the Mutable stuff.
That's right.
You have a bunch of stuff from Bafako, and you even have something that's very similar to a SynthTech module.
Yep.
Now, first of all, have you interacted with the manufacturers on these, or is this just something that you're doing in an emulative manner?
Yeah, I always contact the manufacturers. With SynthTech, you'll notice that one's branded as E series.
Right?
That's because Paul likes his brand, so I'm not going to attempt to make a plugin that matches his modules because I'll get it wrong and he'll have something to say about it. So
Yeah, you would.
uh, I think it's somewhat close, but I would not want to. I would not want to compare that head on with his modules at this
Right.
point right now. Bafako is very excited about the project. I think they've. I don't know this for sure, but I think they've gotten more sales than they have, or they've noticed an increase of sales due to the VCV Rack emulations. Mutable Instruments is such a large Eurorack manufacturer. I don't know if there's enough statistics to really say that at this point. But yeah, all of them are true licensed. I guess you could say licensed, more like gave me the go ahead
Hmm.
to use this stuff. For the mutable ports, everything is based on the open source module DSP that Olivier wrote. And then all the Bafako stuff is analog, so they're modeled by me, and only the panels are cloned.
Well, the other thing is, I noticed that you've got some developers that are really coming up to speed pretty fast. And I recently had a chat with Michael Hetrick,
Yep.
and oh my God, he just laid a big pile of pretty amazing stuff on the community
Yeah.
as well. But I'm just noticing a lot of people just really diving in, as if this has opened the door. The plugin development thing is kind of the open the door for them to take a swing at their own DSP play, just to see if it could fly or not, which is pretty interesting.
It's impossible for me to think in the viewpoint of the plugin developer right now because I'm so into being the application developer. But I do think that I've designed the system to be easy enough for someone with only DSP knowledge to get in and make graphics and a library. Also, you don't need to know anything about build systems to use the software. That's a huge thing.
Oh, that is huge. Yeah.
If you're a Windows developer, then it's very difficult to port to Mac systems, for example. And with this system, I'm basing it on Makefiles only, no CMake or anything like that. It's completely handwritten Makefiles, and that's something that's probably died out, but there is an art to it. And you can make cross-platform build systems that work mostly flawlessly on all systems. And so I think that's a big thing. You can make your software work on one system, give the source code to other developers, and then they'll build it for the other two operating systems.
Which is the operating system you're focused on?
I develop on Linux, but I have half a dozen computers on my desk right now where I test other builds.
Uh-huh.
I need to automate more of that stuff. It takes me probably 2 minutes to make a build of something per computer, which is annoying, but it'd be nice if I could do that in 3 seconds. Just push everything all at once. But I'm a Linux user. I write all the stuff on Linux and mostly test it on Linux. It's a pretty consistent operating system. I think a lot of people have problems with different distros, but once you really work out those details, the systems are very consistent and they do what you tell it to.
Yeah, that's true. The problem is there isn't really, or at least I don't know of any like unity of spirit behind which distro really works for musicians or music people, right? It seems to kind of fly back and forth, and Ubuntu Studio is kind of sometimes
Mhm.
pointed at, and then sometimes people are like, oh no, the Mint thing, and it gets a little, the second that I have to start weighing operating system variants, I
Yep.
need to take a nap, and then when I wake up, I'm going to get a little drunk because that's definitely not a thing that I'm into. As a Linux guy, what is the variant that you find most suitable for doing this kind of stuff? For doing the using part of it, not necessarily the development part of it.
Oh, I haven't used Linux in years. I've just developed on it.
Oh, that's funny.
I'm a really bad person to ask. I use Arch Linux.
Uh-huh.
Let's see, I've had my Arch installation for 6 years. I just take the hard drive out, put it into another computer, and fix the compatibility problems. I don't want to change anything because I spent years setting everything up. You kind of have to do that with Arch, but once you get everything exactly the way you want, then you can go at 100% efficiency, and
Right.
that's what I've reached eventually.
But that's like so much different than Windows and Mac users. I'm a Mac user, and believe me, one of the things I feel like is I actually feel sometimes like Apple is out to get me. They're out to make it no longer viable for me to be a computer user because it seems like
Mhm.
every update that comes out, I'm forced into using it. Being forced to use it means that also then I'm forced into whatever added inefficiencies there are, and
Right.
eventually those stack up enough that I have to get a machine upgrade that I don't actually want. It ends up being really,
Mhm.
really frustrating.
It is. Yeah, I have a few MacBooks. They tend to do that. I don't know what it is, but Windows and Mac both only last for 3 years, and then you have to reinstall the operating system to get
Yeah.
rid of the crap. Yeah,
Yeah,
I really
sometimes.
have no good recommendation of operating systems. I
Well,
there are
clearly
none.
not if you're hauling a 6-year-old one around in a hard drive because
Well,
that's the
yeah,
best way for you to roll.
it's Arch Linux though, so it's a rolling distro, so it's always updated. There's no version of the operating system. I
I
just
see.
update to all the latest packages.
I
It's really
see.
nice.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. So, um, from a plugin developer standpoint, though, I get that you don't feel super confident talking about it, but you do have to interact with them, I'm sure. Are you the
Sure.
feedback that you get from them? Do you find that they feel like things are pretty efficient for them to get stuff working for them?
I think so. I've been told a number of times that this is an easy platform to get going on. I kind of want to attribute that to the build system,
Hmm.
but I think C++, it's not the most exciting language to learn in. It's definitely not the easiest. It's probably one of the hardest, but it does everything that you could possibly imagine. You can hack it to do whatever you want. It's very universal. Many people know it. If I did this in Java, people have opinions about that, whereas no one really has opinions about C++. You just do it.
It's hilarious you say that because recently I've been going to like computer language meetups,
Mm.
and I go to the JavaScript ones, and there are like little camps. There's the
Well, the
Angular,
JavaScript ones are, yeah.
yeah, there's the Angular camp, there's the functional JavaScript camp, there's the ES Next camp, there's the camp that's like I really want everything to be be able to run on IE6, and it just makes my head want to blow up. Conversely, I go to the C++ thing, and basically the question everyone has is, how does that affect the heap? You know? and assuming that whatever you're talking about isn't a big problem, everyone's like, well, that sounds like a good option. It's really interesting to see like a completely, maybe not as dynamic and as exciting, but certainly maybe easier to please, I would say. But
Possibly so, yeah.
it does make me wonder though. Did you had you considered at all doing this for the web instead of the for the computer? Just because that would eliminate, the browser makes a certain amount of stuff just kind of
Mhm.
ubiquitously available.
Yeah, I've considered it, and maybe with WebAssembly and all these fancy technologies coming out, maybe it's viable that you can actually do DSP and the graphics that I'm doing at about the same performance of just running it natively.
Right. Well, you do have the problem though that you would be dependent on sort of web audio to provide your thing.
Right.
It'd be pretty difficult to get to the lowest level on that, like you have been able to do with C++.
Yeah, I think WebAssembly kind of solves that too because you can just process buffers with WebAssembly, and it should run at about the same speed. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it doesn't enable the SIMD instructions and other fancy things that you get with CPUs. It's getting there. Maybe I've actually seen some DAWs come out that are entirely web based. So I did consider it, but I think the problem right now with those is even though they might do everything you want, you can't really take it seriously because it's in the browser, and you don't have to dedicate yourself to installing it on your system and getting everything to work. And then you have to rely on how are you going to save files? Is the company going to be around in a year? Most of the time, you can't just download the systems. I mean, theoretically you can, but it's whether they let you.
Right, sure. Well, the other thing that I'm curious about, because again, when I was on the setup, I was just fooling around with it last night. Um, and I noticed that there's for the first time that I noticed, there's a plugin available that you're charging for.
Yep, that's right.
And
And
what's the story behind that?
we'll have a few more, probably half a dozen by the time this podcast comes out.
Okay.
Right now, I would like to work toward the goal of working on Rack full time for the next year.
Hmm.
And the only way that's going to happen is if I get some financial compensation from it.
Sure.
So that's my attempt at doing that. I'd also like to work on plugins which actually require an investment, such as renting a surge system or just buying a bunch of oscillators. I have a bunch of lab equipment for testing analog hardware, but I'd like to upgrade that as well. So there are finances. I'd like to test on more computers. Yep, there are finances. So not everything is going to be free open source, but it'll be up to the par of commercial alternatives. So the open source stuff, I think the goal is to make that true competitors to commercial software.
Right.
But the only way to do that is if you have a little bit of financial compensation. So
Sure.
all the commercial plugins will be used to finance the open source ones. We have a few in the design queue right now that are really exciting, but I just don't see it possible. I don't see a possibility of releasing them as open source just because they would take too much time, and I need to eat.
Right. Yeah, I hear that. Well, now, the other thing that actually would make that even more powerful is if people were able to more easily hybridize their existing hardware with the software, whether
Mhm.
it's, so like for me with Macs, I do that with like the Expert Sleepers modules, right? Is there any plans to make something that very easily allows interaction so that you could think of VCV Rack as sort of like a modular expander for my physical rack?
You can do a lot of that right now. I think the way to improve compatibility is just to add more modules to the core plugin, which actually isn't really a plugin. It's just built into Rack itself.
Hmm.
All the core modules should be open source, I think, because eventually when people start fixing problems with their expert sleepers or whatever, if I don't have exactly their system, but they do, then they can fix it themselves, send back
Right.
the changes, and it work for everyone.
Right.
So there's an advantage of working on the integration with other hardware and compatibility issues, working on that in a collaboration, open source. I think the way it's typically been done is if you want some plugin to interface with another piece of software, you'd have to pay for that to finance the research and development of trying it on every single computer imaginable.
Right.
But instead of doing that, you can just ask people to send in patches if it doesn't work for them.
Hmm.
Not every musician is a programmer, but I think the few that are powerful enough to replace that model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the other thing is, I'm imagine I'm going to be only the 45,000th person to ask, is what is your plans for interfacing this in the world of plugins?
The VST and AU plugin, which will be called VCV Bridge, will come out. I don't want to say a date, but around version 1.0.
Okay.
It'll be available for testing a little bit before that. That plugin will allow you to connect Rack to any digital audio workstation that supports VST or AU plugins.
Okay.
You launch Rack and then you launch your audio workstation. And it actually doesn't matter what order you launch those in, but the VST plugin stores a channel which is connected to a module set on that same channel. I think you can choose between 1 and 64.
Okay.
And stereo audio and MIDI and DAW automation will go into that module, and then stereo output will go out of the module. So it's a way to cope with the fact that Rack is not a VST.
Right.
And it probably never will be. You can think of Rack as a bit like Reason.
Yeah, I was going to say it has a lot. It sounds like it has a lot of parallels to Rewire without necessarily having to be a whole new system that everyone has to adopt.
Right. I'm not sure why Propellerhead didn't do that actually, because maybe there's some problems with it. But with Rewire, I think there's an order you have to open Reason versus Ableton Live, for example.
Right. Because that determines who's the master, and
each piece of software has to actually include Rewire. So I'm not probably going to get Ableton to include the Rack interface if that exists. So my second bet is to just use their existing format, which is VST2, and just make a VST2 plugin that sends audio. So you can have up to 64, but I think in practice you probably won't be able to get up that much. In practice, you shouldn't need that many because that's 64
a little
channels.
overwhelming. I know, right? Well, we've run out of time as expected. I have a bunch of other stuff I'd love to ask you, but before we go, I do want to just sort of like probe here a little bit. What's the near-term future? What are the things we're going to see in the next few months? Because at the rate that you're going here, if you don't solve world peace pretty soon, I'm going to think that you're taking a nap because you are burning through stuff at an amazing rate. What are we going to see in the next few months?
On the plate for the next few months are some new commercial plugins. better stability for rack itself. That's one thing that a lot of people have problems with. It doesn't work on my Commodore 64, so I'll fix all those problems. Not the Commodore 64.
Not the Commodore 64 one. Good. I'm glad you don't go down that route.
So I'll be fixing stability issues. I haven't done anything for performance, so I'll be doing performance enhancements and optimizations in the next couple of months. So just making it a little bit more professional as a viable alternative to loading up a VST into a DAW. I'd like people to use Rack with the same expectations of their existing professional software. So it's not a very concrete to-do list, but it's a lot of work to do. So that's what the next couple of months will bring. And then, of course, new open source plugins. We're going to be adding to fundamentals pretty much for the next year. We'll have dozens and dozens of plugins just to expand the initial system that you get when you first install a rack. They'll always get a little bit better than the last ones, and then we'll have to go back and fix the other ones up to the standards of the new ones. So we'll be doing that as well.
I mean, that sounds really exciting. I want to thank you for the time that you spent here. This is really great, and I'm really looking forward to the work that you're going to be coming up with, because I've been blown away with the stuff that you've already done. So thank you for that.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. Thanks a lot, and have a good one.
All right, bye.
Bye. And there you go. Really interesting information from Andrew. If you haven't tried out VCV Rack yet, you'll want to do so at vcvrack.com. Thanks again to Synthtopia for their help with this series. And thanks again to Isotonic Studios for their support. Catch you next week. Bye.